Why did Jesus have to meet Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration? Throughout Jesus' ministry, there were moments that became real milestones in revealing who he was. One of these moments happened on top of a mountain, in front of 3 of his closest disciples. There, something extraordinary happened. Jesus was transfigured. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became resplendent. But the most intriguing fact was not the manifestation of his glory, but the presence of 2 central figures in Israel's history, Moses and Elijah. But why did Jesus meet these very men on that mountain? The Bible doesn't make it clear why this encounter took place. However, based on the scriptures, we can make some considerations on this subject. In this video, I'm going to reveal 3 possible reasons why Jesus had to meet Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. Follow me and discover the truth. The first reason for this encounter could have been to confirm Jesus' divinity. On the Mount of Transfiguration, while Jesus was shining in glory, the scene was interrupted by the voice of God himself echoing from heaven. The words were direct, unequivocal, and solemn. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Matthew 17:5. This declaration was not just a supernatural manifestation, but a public authentication of Jesus' identity. In Jewish tradition, any statement needed witnesses, and there, in front of Peter, James, and John, God the Father stands as the supreme witness, confirming that Jesus was not just a prophet nor a teacher, but the Messiah, the beloved Son who glorifies the Father. Notice how this confirmation fits into the biblical context. Moses represented the law, and Elijah represented the prophets, and both pointed to someone greater who was to come. When God says, "To him I have heard," he is declaring that, although the law and the prophets were fundamental, the final and definitive word comes through Jesus. This statement places Christ at the center of divine revelation, putting an end to doubts, and making it clear to the disciples that they were not following just any spiritual leader, but the Messiah sent by God himself. What's more, this confirmation comes just before Jesus' journey to Jerusalem and the cross. So the disciples needed to be sure of who he was so that they wouldn't waver when they saw him suffer and die. In other words, the glory revealed on that mountain and the voice of God would serve as a foundation for their faith in the darkest days to come. Second reason, transition from the Old to the New Covenant. The presence of Moses and Elijah alongside Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration marks a turning point in the history of God's revelation to humanity. Moses, as legislator, represents the Old Covenant, signed at Sinai based on commandments, rituals, and sacrifices that pointed to something greater. Elijah, as a prophet, represents the voice of God throughout the centuries, calling the people to repentance and pointing to the future hope of a Messiah. However, when Jesus appears among them, something profound is being revealed. The law and the prophets are not ends in themselves, but arrows pointing to Christ. The Transfiguration shows the disciples that history is changing phases. Until then, the people lived under the guidance of the Mosaic Law and awaited the fulfillment of the prophecies. But there, on the top of the mountain, it becomes clear that the fullness of these promises is being fulfilled in Jesus. Notice that after the glorious vision, Moses and Elijah disappear, and the disciples look up and see only Jesus. This doesn't happen by chance. It's a message indicating that from that moment on, he is the central point of reference. Not that the law and the prophets are annulled, but now they find their fulfillment in the person of Christ. Later, the writer to the Hebrews would affirm this by saying, God, who in time past spoke to the fathers by the prophets at many times and in many ways, has in these last days spoken to us by His Son. Looking at it from this angle, the Transfiguration shows that the Old Covenant has fulfilled its preparatory role, but now a new covenant is being inaugurated, no longer based on stone tablets or repeated sacrifices, but founded on God's own Son, who would bring forgiveness and definitive reconciliation through His death and resurrection. The third reason for the encounter was to strengthen him for the mission. The Transfiguration didn't happen at a random moment in Jesus' life. It took place shortly before his decisive journey to Jerusalem, where he would face rejection, suffering, and his own death on the cross. In this context, the encounter with Moses and Elijah becomes more than just a sign for the disciples. It is also an intimate strengthening for the mission he was about to fulfill. Luke's Gospel gives us a perspective for this interpretation. Behold, they appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. The word translated as departure in the Greek text is exodus. In other words, Moses and Elijah were talking to Jesus about the great exodus that he would accomplish. Not the liberation of a people from the slavery of Egypt, but the definitive liberation of humanity from sin and death. Think about it. Jesus, even though he was the Son of God, fully took on the human condition, including weariness, sadness, and anguish. As the most difficult moment of his mission approached, the Father granted him a glimpse of glory and a dialogue with two figures who knew what it was like to face opposition and trust in God's promises. Moses faced the weight of leading a rebellious people through the desert. Elijah faced ungodly kings and felt alone, to the point of asking for death. Both, however, were sustained by God in their missions. So the Transfiguration was not just a manifestation of glory in the eyes of the disciples, it was also a strategic moment in which Jesus was encouraged to keep going, even though he knew his destination was Calvary. All this reminds us that just as the disciples were invited to listen to the Son, we too need to direct our attention and obedience to Him, recognizing that it is in Jesus that God's final and complete revelation is to be found. Now, I'd like to know what you think. What struck you most about this episode? Leave your comment below. Also, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel so you can follow more content like this. May the Lord bless you greatly.